Hello, everyone. I'm going to try to be loud and clear. I'm really excited to always talk about this project because it's been, I would say, one of the most incredible projects in my career. And I'm going to start by thanking my co-authors in crime, Claudia Chemello and Jerrad Alexander. They've been absolutely amazing on this project, as well as many others that are going to be that I'm going to talk about during this presentation. When Jeff Bezos decided to go after the Apollo-11 engines, that was kind of a crazy endeavor because the Apollo era launched, you had 13 missions and 65 engines lost in total. And what he wanted to do was to get one of the 5 that would at least be from Apollo 11. So you can imagine the difficulty of going on underwater at a depth of down to 14,000 feet, which is deeper than the Titanic, and scanning the seabed for those engines in particular, knowing that the crash site was kind of vague and the area was around 300 square miles. So it's absolutely unbelievable how difficult that was. So when we started this project, the understanding was that we would work with an amazing group of people, marine engineers, archaeologists, conservators, historians, and these people were all part of this team, and we had not met with all of them, but gradually as we went, the objective was to recover the engines and then start working on them and conserve them with our partner, the Kansas Cosmosphere in Hutchinson, Kansas. And the goal was to recover the engine and be able to essentially get those giant machines that were attached to the rocket and jettisoned after 2.5 minutes after reaching a speed of Mach 7. So about 45 miles of altitude, and then going back and hitting the surface at about 400 to 500 miles per hour. So the F1 engines were quite huge, 18 feet in height, and the most solid part of the engine, I would say, was the thrust chamber itself. And while there were hopes to recover engines that were in more complete than we actually did, the conservators were kind of, on the side of saying, well, it's probably going to be bits and pieces and probably not entire engines. The recovery operations were carried out using extremely sophisticated vessels and ROVs capable of lifting those engine parts from the seabed where they were totally embedded or sometimes partially embedded. You've got a thrust chamber on that photograph here being recovered by the ROV. And then you had baskets to be able to lift them up back to the surface. The of course, the engines or parts of the engines were in a very severe state of deformation, corrosion, and there was no way to tell which mission we were talking about. So the project ended up by recovering 12.5 tons of materials from the likely site where Apollo 11 engines could have been. That's a heat exchanger that you see here. Lots of different materials. And I thought that the allegory of Star Wars is really good here. The trash compactor, that's almost the situation we were in after the recovery of the engines and in the lab, where you see a lot of hardware. And I have to say that this project is absolutely amazing in complexity, because there was no roadmap for dealing with space artifacts. There was not one publication that was usable for us to put a conservation plan together. So everything had to be done, I would say, from scratch. And we are archaeological conservators, and we have a specialty in marine archaeology and marine conservation. So for us, it was a sort of natural approach to conserve and look at this collection like we would do on a Roman shipwreck or a 19th century shipwreck or any underwater site. The idea was to apply our knowledge to modern materials, superalloys, and apply the principle of maritime conservation to this collection, and also to work with people who had a knowledge we didn't have, space engineers, people who could help us with the understanding of what those objects were. But there were a lot of unknowns, and in particular the materials. While we had the Rocketdyne familiarization manual, there was no bill of materials, and we didn't know what we were dealing with. And we were concerned about safety issues as well. Asbestos, beryllium, materials that could be extremely dangerous to the conservators. Here you've got one of the basins showing the showering technique that we've used immediately after recovery. One of the principles of marine conservation is that you never let the artifacts dry. You want to keep them wet all the time. Otherwise, they start oxidizing and you start losing information. So you have a nice sampling here of various bits and pieces, thrust chambers in the back. At the front, you have turbo pumps that were used to move the propellant about 3 tons per second into the thrust chamber. So those were very, very interesting artifacts and very complex. Here you have a view of the lab during the initial storage of the artifacts. You can see that the rust is very predominant. You can also see that you have no concretions like you would have on a normal shipwreck because it's too deep. The carbonates cannot form and cover your objects like you would have on a shallow shipwreck. The outriggers that were attached to these thrust chambers were made of steel, and all of them were corroded. And all of the iron here is coming from the dissolution of the outriggers and other attachments that were attached to the thrust chambers. The degree of corrosion and deterioration was absolutely unbelievable. There is no way to talk to a corrosion engineer and tell him how corroded those materials were, because none of them had seen what we've seen on those objects. And the reason for that is because most of those superalloys are not designed to be deprived from oxygen. They form passivation films when they are exposed to oxygen, and they have wonderful properties when they are in use, but not when they are buried in a stagnant environment, and particularly under the sediment. So if you had a piece of iron, for instance, the corrosion would be less on the seabed because you have less corrosion. But if you're dealing with superalloys, this is the opposite. And so that's a degree of corrosion we were experiencing on some of the turbopumps. The outer casing that is made of aluminum had totally collapsed, and all you have is the interior of that turbopump. You have about 10 different alloys on that single artifact. I'll show you a photograph later that illustrates it. So some views of this white material here, a gelatinous product that forms around the corrosion of aluminum underwater. It's like a jelly, if you want. Here it's interesting because you can see a nice demarcation line. A nice demarcation line here between the part that was exposed to the sediment, exposed to outside the sediment, and the part that was buried that is completely corroded. This is a fuel injector, and on that fuel injector, the fuel injectors were essentially shower heads that would disperse the propellant inside the thrust chambers. And they were made of pure copper pressed against the back, which is stainless steel. And you can see the corrosion pits are absolutely unbelievable. And the only place where I've seen that type of corrosion was on the bullets from the Titanic, where you had similar degrees of corrosion. The other side of the fuel injectors, like I was saying, are made of pure copper. And you can see the level of corrosion on those fuel injectors. And those fuel injectors have about 3,000 orifices in which the propellant was going through and was being directed inside the thrust chamber. So in terms of corrosion, when you have so many intricacies, it becomes very complicated to preserve the artifact and prevent them from corroding in the long run. Over there, just to mention John Broadwater, it's not a great photo of him, but he was the project's archaeologist, and he was a fantastic guy to work with. And right next to him, you've got a LOX dome here. The LOX dome is essentially the part that is attached to the rocket and has a gimbal. And we're going to talk about that. That's John Broadwater and I looking at the thrust chamber that will end up by being identified as coming from engine 5 from Apollo 11. And you can see the absolute deterioration of that thrust chamber, and the jacket is completely exploded here. The type and degree of corrosion, like I said, was totally unbelievable. And the bacterial corrosion was also huge. And this is the type of corrosion you would witness on stainless steel, for instance. The blades from the turbines were also analyzed and x-rayed, and there's a big study that that Claudia is leading with NIST right now on the analysis of those blades and their conservation. But just to give you an idea, some of those blades had lost 90% of their weight in corrosion. And the amount of internal corrosion in those blades was unbelievable. So you could have, on the one hand, one blade that would be almost intact next to another one who was totally corroded. And it was very difficult to make sense of those things. And this is why working with material scientists, and particularly the scientists from NIST, National Institutes for Standards and Technology, and particularly Tim Fick and Adam Crossinger, was absolutely amazing. Identifying the materials was very difficult because, like I said, there was no information from Rocketdyne telling you what alloy was used. So we had to analyze those materials to the best of our capabilities. Sometimes the name of the alloy was still visible on the metal. That's a stainless steel René 41 here, but most of the time we didn't have that luck. And we had to find ways to analyze those materials. That's a turbo pump right here, showing you the complexity of the object. And the goal when you have materials like that is to identify them, understand how they are going to degrade when exposed to air, try to find ways to take them apart if it's feasible. But we knew that taking apart a turbo pump would be almost impossible or would be extremely difficult to put back together. So we had to find holistic treatments that would allow us to conserve those objects in the long term. Like I said, we had manuals that we were able to use, and Jerrad Alexander, who is really knowledgeable and has worked extensively on those on similar artifacts, was really helpful. This is a description of just a few materials that were found on that turbo pump. And this is a view of one turbo pump after conservation. And I think that Rachel, this is one of the turbo pumps you have on display at the Smithsonian. So when you have all those materials working together against each other, it's quite difficult. So you really have to look for the most fragile one and try to find a window where you're going to be able to treat the others. Another challenge was to be able to clean the artifacts without removing traces of use, without damaging ephemeral traces resulting from their history. So here you've got a heat exchanger before and after cleaning. And while you've removed the rust during cleaning, you still have the soot visible on the artifact, which is quite unbelievable because that soot formed during 2.5 minutes and then everything stopped, fell into the bottom of the ocean and stayed over there. So finding techniques that would not erase these traces was really important for us. Sometimes the stencils on the thrust chambers were only visible because of the rust surrounding those thrust chambers. So if you would remove the rust, you would remove the stencil. And the reason why you have this negative number is probably because at the time of the recovery, you still had paint on them. But the simple fact of lifting them and putting them in the basket was enough to remove the paint from those stencils, hence what you have here and needs to be preserved. Sometimes the information was not visible. You needed to use ultraviolet light to see them. And those numbers could really easily disappear if you would, for instance, keep them under the showering system for too long. So you had to really look for them at the beginning of the treatment because there was a risk of losing those things. And so that's what archaeological conservators do. Before anything happens, they start to document everything possible. And working like this allowed us to identify this particular stencil was really important because it tracked down the unit number down to engine 5 from Apollo 11. And Jerrad Alexander is the one who found this stencil. The corrosion, matching the numbers and trying to make sense of all of that was in itself a huge endeavor. And this is what we were all doing, working together, taking molds, trying to decipher some of those corroded metals. But this is what we've been doing for 2.5 years, which is essentially the duration of that treatment, which is very short for a maritime project. So the treatment strategies, I've talked a little bit about it. It all starts with, keeping the artifacts wet, making sure that the artifacts are immersed, making sure that whatever solution you're using is not going to damage one other or several other materials. And you want to make sure that whatever you're using is compatible. Otherwise, you would start corroding one material and preserve another, which is not something we wanted to do. So usually just using water is probably the simplest thing. And then we move to different types of corrosion inhibitors and surfactants that we've tested on samples before we applied it to larger artifacts. This is one of the turbo pumps in silicates and I forgot the exact chemical, sorry. But it's a silicate-based corrosion inhibitor that is used for the stabilization of iron and aluminum together, which is what we had here, because we had some iron that absolutely had to be stabilized together. And so this is during the cathodic protection of this engine in that solution. That's Jerrad and I looking at the turbo pump during treatment. So the idea here was to keep it together, not to take it apart. We've tried to remove the impeller. We've looked into the feasibility of doing that, and we said no, because we're going to create more damage by doing that than trying to apply a technique that would be suitable to the entire object. That's Jerrad and Claudia looking at this engine, at this turbo pump. No, that's another one. That's the other one that is totally stripped. But that gives you an idea of the scale of the treatment and complexity. Having the team from the Cosmosphere work with us was great because they are metal fabricators, and we were able to fabricate tools specific that would allow us to dismantle some of those artifacts. And it was absolutely essential, particularly for the separation of the LOX domes and also separation of the turbines that were in an extremely corroded state. So this object is a LOX dome, and on the LOX dome you've got that remain of a gimbal, and the gimbals were used to make the engines move. All of them were moving at the exception of the central one. And you see that the steel is completely corroded, but you still have a base attached to the LOX dome. But what is interesting is that the fabric fiberglass is lined with Teflon, and this has survived. It's quite amazing because this is the only gimbal or remain of gimbal that we were able to find on the entire collection. So this is the LOX dome and the gimbal preserved, and Rachel is going to talk about the collection, and this is part of the display right now at the Smithsonian. A photo of Claudia working on a fuel injector here, and I'm just going to go very quickly into the treatment of the fuel injectors. And in order to stabilize the entire the voids inside the injector, you had to first understand what you wanted to remove and why you wanted to remove the corrosion. And after analysis, we found that certain corrosion products that are part of what we call generally bronze disease were present on that particular object and actually on all the fuel injectors. So the idea was to remove the corrosion products completely without damaging the copper or the stainless steel. And one of the solutions that we found was to use Rochelle salts. Rochelle salts are strong chelating agents that allow you to dissolve the copper corrosion products. And you can see the complex, the tartrate complex forming after immersing the fuel injector into that solution right here. So you would not do that on a bronze sculpture from a Greek or from a Roman shipwreck. You would not do that. But in that particular case, it was the only way to remove the corrosion products and stabilize the entire object. And I was talking to Jerrad recently, who looked at the artifact, and I said, are they still doing well after several years of treatment? And he said, I couldn't find corrosion on them. So I'm quite happy when I hear that. But we've really put a lot of effort into stabilizing those artifacts. This is the fuel injector from engine number 5 from Apollo 11 right here. Sometimes the cleaning can only occur when, mechanically, and one of the techniques that we've used to really do some surgical cleaning was to use dry ice cleaning. That's a method that worked very well on those engines. You can see Jerrad and Claudia doing some dry ice cleaning right there. You can see an image of a heat exchanger during the finishing treatment. Really proud to show this image, and the scale is quite cool, of this turbo pump on the left. And on the right, on the bottom right, you can see an original turbo pump with the original Rocketdyne guy working on it, and us trying to remove the impeller, and we did not at the end, just to make the story a little bit short. And on the top right, how the artifact looked like before treatment. An example of a before and after thrust chamber. A thrust chamber after treatment, when Jerrad and I were reinstalling the electric wire looms that had survived to some extent after the crash and after treatment, which is good. You've got a view here of the thrust chambers, and Apollo 11, 12, 14, and 16 were positively identified, but we only have one engine from Apollo 11. This is a view of the engine from Apollo 11 at the Smithsonian. I'm not going to talk more about that, but this is a wonderful display, wonderful support, showing you the various parts of this survivor. That is absolutely amazing. And Rachel is going to talk about this amazing collection. That's a great memory. Meeting Buzz Aldrin, we came to visit the lab and discussing the treatment. It was a real treat to meet him. And I want to thank all these people for their great work and assistance. This is not a project you tackle on your own. This is something you do with a team of unbelievable people. And this is what we did. And there are two publications on the bottom. One, 2016, that is readily available about the story of the treatment. And another one that is forthcoming that Claudia is going to publish very soon. Thank you very much.